Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Secure Your SAP Environment, Improve Security and Reduce Operational Risks, hosted by SAP Insider and presented by SUSE. I'm Robert Holland from SAP Insider, and I will be your moderator today. Just a few announcements before we begin. This is a pre-recorded webinar, but we invite you to submit your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window. At the conclusion of the webinar, the questions will be collected and we will ensure that they are all answered. Following the webinar, you will receive an email with details on how to access the recording on demand. This will include access to the slides from today's session. Now, onto the presentation. Discussing today's topic will be Alan Clarke. Alan is the SAP Alliance Director, EMEA North at SUSE. Alan, welcome to the webinar, and thank you for speaking to the SAP Insider audience today.
Thank you very much, Robert. Pleasure to be here.
All right, so I'm going to hand it over to you, and then we'll come back when you're done for a couple of questions.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, well, welcome everybody. Again, thanks very much for your time and attention in advance of today's material. So we're really trying to drill in on security around SAP. Some of this is specific to SUSE Linux, where it's the underlying OS for many SAP environments operating out there today, but some of it is also a little bit more generic. So we'll try and cover off this within the next kind of 25 minutes or so, and hopefully you'll find some of this useful or enlightening. So just to give you an idea about what we're going to cover today, these are really the areas we're going to drill into today. So just, today, what's different from before, what's going on today in the world of security and where that relates to SAP environments, suggestions on how to improve the security of your SAP environment, security specifically from a Linux operating system layer perspective, and then some more sort of kind of generic security best practices that may be things you may not have thought about, or will need to think about if perhaps you're looking at an SAP transformation project, which of course a lot of customers, SAP customers, are today. And then we'll just kind of wrap things up, and then Robert and I will have a further chat. So, digital transformation creates new security relevant targets. Espionage, sabotage, and data theft have much higher impacts from a digital infrastructure perspective due to the increasing amounts of sensitive digital data and our increasing dependencies around society, politics, influences in those areas. And as I'm sure we all know, we see this every day, a steadily increasing number of security incidents and breaches and attacks are taking place worldwide, and this happens on a daily basis. I don't think, like many of you, I'm sure, I don't think a day goes by where I don't have something flash up in my inbox from one of the sources such as IT Pro. I had one yesterday about another breach. This happens all the time, all around us, and unfortunately, that is the sad situation we face. So, new geopolitical situations will influence heavily the number of cyber attacks and successful attacks on critical IT infrastructures, and these can all have serious consequences, I'm sure we can imagine. So we can't really be too careful when it comes to IT security. And what we're going to do today, as I say, is to drill into one area of the SAP stack today, particularly around the underlying OS. But as I say, I will cover some other areas just by default. So causes of concern, so while I've been talking here, I'm sure you can see some of these statistics, all of them very sobering reading. And I'm not going to go into these one by one because you can see in the bottom right there all the sources of these, and feel free to go and interrogate them if you wish. But this is the world we're facing. We're all too aware of this. This has been around for a long time in different forms and identities, but I don't think it's ever been as refined or as prevalent as it is today. And again, you can see the sources that have produced this sort of data, and here you could also see specifically some of the companies that have been affected. You could spend hours and hours trolling the internet, finding out all sorts of, trawling the internet, finding out all sorts of information around attacks and breaches and security breaches. And these are just some examples here. Obviously, you see some of the names, some pretty big names with Twitter and Marriott and LinkedIn. A lot of it is all about exposed data. I've had emails personally where from a hotel chain where they say, well, your data could have been, sensitive credit card data, etc., could have been compromised. Please check this. I'm sure many of you out there have had the same. This is all very concerning and it happens all the time. And it's all about what we can do, best endeavours to try and prevent as much of this as possible. Furthermore, more recently, you look at these from last year, Rackspace, this happened in December. The full impact of that and cost of that has not yet been finalised. Watch this space on that. Cisco, a little bit embarrassing because Cisco, of course, produced some cybersecurity software themselves. They managed to get in front of this before the full ransomware was deployed. But even so, it's still a breach. It's still a valid incident, and it's something that even a cybersecurity company can fall victim to. I'll draw your attention to the Glen County Office of Education there. Ransomware, you can see there, teacher and student data was exposed, and it was a $400,000 demand. Bringing that closer to home, one of my best friends is a headmaster at a local school, and a few weeks ago he walked into the same situation where there was ransomware demand, data had been stolen. So it even happens extremely close to home to people we know, albeit I think education is a bit of a hot target. So it's out there. We need to be fully aware of it. We cannot underestimate the impact and the cost that these attacks and breaches can have. And particularly with regard to SAP security, we need to be on top of all the housekeeping and shore up those defences as much as we can, as I say, from a best endeavours perspective. So SAP systems, as we know, form the digital heart of an enterprise, and espionage, sabotage and data theft targeted on SAP systems can have serious economical consequences for an organisation. So with data theft, it's the potential loss of business critical data. With espionage, it's attacks directed on specific business critical information. And with sabotage, it's the consequences of longer downtimes from a successful ransomware attack. So a central system, an ERP system that stores business critical data like SAP, historically investments into the security of these landscapes have not been relative, and they're often minimal investments into what the ultimate cost could be from a successful ransomware or cyber attack. So SAP security has always been important, but companies, as I say, have often put it on a bit of a low priority in the past. And however, what we're finding now, particularly from our experiences with the customers, is there is a new mindset, and all that's going on that I've been talked about today so far, it has raised the awareness levels to the point that it is an extremely hot topic, as it should. But let's just go back and start with the kind of, the dimensions of security, and there are always two here. One is organizational, and one is technological, and both must be in balance. Like the Force, if you're a Star Wars fan, everything must be in balance here between these two, because if one gets more focused than the other, then that's going to lead to potential vulnerability. So equal focus and investment on both of these areas must be given. So this could be quite helpful. If it's not something you're already aware of, then please do, have a look into this. You can see the link in the bottom right hand corner. This is nothing SUSE specific here. This is this is just the 18 levels, as it were, the 18 points that the Centre of Internet Security, the CIS, have deemed as the areas that should be given a lot of focus. And if you follow all of these, then you're not going to be going too far wrong. Now, obviously, each of these are just headlines, and you kind of got to drill into each one of these to unlock the greater detail beneath each. And make sure that all of these are factored into your security plans from your SAP environment perspective. But if you do this, this is going to count significantly towards that best practice approach I was talking to a little earlier. So to say, follow that link and do look at all of these aspects and try and work them into your security plans, whether that's for your current systems or when you're looking at your transformation projects that of course many customers are facing, as I've already mentioned. So I'm gonna take the example here just to bring some points across of S/4HANA in the cloud. But a lot of what I'm going to talk about, as I say, applies regardless of where your SAP environment is running or is deployed. So there's these three distinct levels, these three layers. The cloud infrastructure layer in the example I'm talking about, and that's obviously we're talking about Azure, GCP, AWS, or private cloud. The OS layer beneath that, and then of course the SAP applications and database layer. But today, of course, we're going to drill into the OS layer from a security perspective. So the role of the operating system. So before we jump specifically into SUSE Linux for SAP applications, the OS itself specifically, I just want to kind of highlight the most commonly seen attack vectors for SAP systems. One, of course, is getting user access to the applications themselves, or admin access to the databases, or of course then access to the OS sitting beneath those. The worst case scenario, of course, is the combination of all three. Now, given that a significant number of these workloads in the world today, whether it's an R3 environment or S4, run on an enterprise Linux OS, either holistically or specific components, and given that SAP HANA itself can only run on one of two SAP certified enterprise Linux OSs, it's really critical that the OS is as secure as possible, because command line access gained via Linux and SAP credentials essentially will give the cyber criminals, the bad guys, full control to effectively kind of run riot with the crown jewels of a business, which is the SAP system itself. So these are the key areas that need focus around the OS. So breaking into the system, it's the OS, as I say, it's a common target for these people, and attacks can come from external sources, or i.e. someone accessing this remotely, or of course it can come from someone who's already on the inside with a degree of access but wants to gain more privileges, i.e. ultimately root level access. And of course then these attacks will exploit any weak links or vulnerability in order for the individual or individuals to gain access to the SAP systems in full. So vulnerability security patches, how does it work when there is one identified? So these are reported via the CVE system, the Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures System, and their inherent processes. And if these are identified then immediately by cyber criminals, they will immediately start to attempt to exploit them. And then these are known as zero-day exploits. And these, for instance, can be, if they do gain access to this kind of critical information, then these can be traded on the dark web. So they're always sort of unseemly sources for anyone to gain access to these. Now, when a CV is assigned an ID, then the open source code authors, such as SUSE Linux in this case, who are constantly monitoring this, we begin to create these security advisories around that particular vulnerability and provide the appropriate security patches in order to try and get in front of that potential impact and counter the threat or the impact as much as possible. These patches, of course, are distributed via usual update channels, and the customer can implement these as soon as possible. Now, there's a similar process with SAP. However, these securities, these SAP security advisories, are only published generally once a month. I think it's on the second day of the month via the SAP security notes. This is called Security Patch Day, and the customer again, can apply those as soon as they're available. Worth noting that SAP applications will of course, if they're new, will receive all those prior security updates with any new software revision, and it's the same with SUSE Linux. So every time we release a new version, excuse me, or security or service pack, then all of those prior immediately prior updates, security updates, are rolled up into that new service pack or indeed version release. So other kind of third-party software services, applications, as I've mentioned there, for instance, like backup or monitoring software may have slightly different processes, but this is certainly how it works from a SUSE Linux perspective. So looking at from an OS perspective, the kind of must-have security features in your enterprise Linux OS that sits beneath your SAP environment. Certainly certification standards like some of the ones you've seen here. You've got here FIPS 140-2, the common criteria EO4+, and there are several more. They really need to be in there as security endorsement certification endorsements within the OS, because particularly a lot of these are for government and government agencies, and if they're not there, they're just not going to consider it, and rightly so. So that certainly needs to be in whichever OS you choose for your SAP environment. Now, security patches, of course, these are produced and distributed on a regular basis, and if a customer uses our SUSE Live patching module, which is actually included in SUSE for SAP, then this can apply those critical or key patches that I was talking about earlier, for instance, in response to a CVE alert, and it can apply these to the Linux kernel without needing to take down the server in question, which is a huge benefit for SAP customers. And we're seeing more and more of our customers take advantage of that functionality, and are almost now mandating it for future use, because we all know how long it takes to pull down a HANA server. It can be hour and a half in some cases. Then you're trying to investigate the issue, and then you're trying to resolve it, and then bring it back up. The cost of the business is extremely significant. So this is a huge feature for customers, and all of our customers are looking to take advantage of this if they're not already running it. So security and auditing tools are included as well, such as an intrusion detection framework that should be in there. An SAP HANA firewall that will reside locally on the server in question to provide increased security. That's got to be included in there from an OS perspective. The hardening guides, we've got a plethora of resource available around best practice and security hardening guides, again, which we fully endorse to all of our customers to make sure that they follow these and apply these. Again, these are coming from the people who've written the initial code for the OS, so they have to be observed. And in the case of cloud images, then we've got these pre-configured and pre-hardened cloud images for use on all the major hyperscalers, which will mean that all of the security settings, they're already applied and laid down, which is going to save an awful lot of time from a configuration perspective for any admin trying to get these correctly configured in accordance with SAP notes if they're going to be running their SAP environment on Azure, AWS, or Google. So security best practices. Now, there's a few tips to consider here, and we'll kick off with the zero trust approach, which is the opposite of a parameter-based approach. So parameter-based is a scenario where you've got a trusted zone, i.e. inside the network, and an untrusted zone for anything outside. And trusted and untrusted zones are usually connected by the firewall. And this zero trust approach is pretty much exactly what it says on the tin, i.e. you're going to trust no one, but instead secure all of the information streams from within and from external sources. Now, the pandemic and lockdown accelerated this approach because the amount of people working from home, as you can imagine, where employees were using VPNs, etc. So, you know, this is something that we thoroughly recommend. It ultimately can be a little more cost up front, but as I've mentioned, given the cost of a potential breach, it's nothing in comparison and should certainly be looked at as a best practice. Secondly, never expose SAP systems directly to the internet. Now, of course, that might sound like an extremely obvious statement, but it does happen, and there are cases where we found customers have said, no, well, we need to do it in this particular workload instance. Now, if that is absolutely necessary, then it's again a belt and braces scenario, putting in place, you know, taking advantage of all the possible tools here, DMZs, files, etc. But generally, the practice is don't do it unless you absolutely have to. If you do have to, then, as I say, just make sure you've taken advantage of all the preventative tools that are available to you. Always protect SAP app logins with multi-factor authentication. I'm sure we all do it as a lot of practice within our own companies. I know I do every day. I have to log in, and it's a two-factor authentication process. You know, you've got to kind of use your mobile phone, for instance, or biometrics, etc. Again, this would seem like standard practice, but it's surprising and alarming how many customers don't follow this or enforce this very good practice. Always talk to customers about this. Install all of the security software patches, whether it's SAP application, whether it's OS level, and all these hot fixes. Install them, apply them as soon as possible. A lot of companies don't do this until the scheduled downtime or maintenance windows, and sometimes that can only be twice a year. Now, we recommend this is done at least on a monthly basis. As I mentioned earlier, SAP released theirs once a month. Security patches, there's a degree of security update in pretty much every patch that gets released from a Linux perspective. So, you know, we thoroughly recommend that's done as much as possible. But as I say, it should be at least monthly as a best practice. Obviously, if you've got clustering and failover in place, then, you know, the kind of HADR scenario ready for the disaster recovery side of things, then if you've got all of that in place, then it's not too onerous a task as in terms of impact on business operations, because you can use things like SUSE Manager for scheduling all updates and SUSE Live patching to apply patches to the kernel without taking down that particular SAP server. But if you're using clustering, of course, then you've got resource for the business to run while you're applying patches to one, and then you can switch it around and apply to the other. But of course, all of this has to be planned and followed as a strict schedule. To establish the right user roles and access rights, and maintain, uphold and enforce the company sort of security policy at all times. And this, of course, is just good housekeeping from a security perspective. But again, it's surprising how many times it can be allowed to lapse. Lastly, data encryption. Now, of course, this is commonplace, but perhaps tokenization is an option, is not so much. So to do this for sensitive data, what you do is you replace certain values with tokens. So take credit card numbers as an example. If they're stored in an SAP database, you replace those with tokens, and you store the actual numbers in a separate secure store rather than actually in that DB. So the DB then holds a token, which is a map location, a treasure map, if you like, as to where the full CC numbers, credit card numbers are stored. And this has got a big advantage if your data is being stolen, because if your initial data is exposed from the database perspective, it's not actually going to be those credit card numbers themselves. As there's obviously SAP Data Custodian, which does precisely this task. Many of you may be using it. If not, do have a look into that. It's well worthwhile. So security best practices from an OS level perspective. So as I've mentioned here, as just to clarify, we're drilling into best practice available for SUSE Linux for SAP applications rather than the SAP applications and databases themselves here. So first and foremost, follow those guides, follow the guides that come from, for instance, for us, from the hardening guides and configuration guides, and keep the SAP servers as up to date as possible, as often as possible, again, using things like live patching so you can minimize the downtime. Once again, just good housekeeping keeping, but it's got to be done. And so many let this slide and suffer the consequences as a result. Business continuity. So I've already mentioned HA and DR, and these can really, help keep the lights on if there's an incident, as I've mentioned. So if the server's compromised, you normally got to take it down to resolve it, as I mentioned earlier. Resolve it, spin it back up again, and then there's going to be no SAP system available to the business whilst that is being done. So you need that business continuity, you need that kind of security blanket. And using HA and DR strategies means you're going to be able to fail over to other servers whilst one is being attended to. From an authentication perspective, you only use, SSH private key authentication, disallow passwords, and disable login by the root user specifically. Monitoring system changes again. This is a given to ensure nothing's compromised, and you've got to take advantage of all the audit functionality there and ensure all the event logs are forwarded to an SEIM, a security and information and event manager, which is in short a solution that's going to detect, analyze, and help resolve potential security breaches, acting upon them maybe before they do any major damage or any damage at all. Ensure that data volume encryption, data redo log encryption, and backup encryption for SAP HANA, that they're all enabled. And once again, to an admin, that this may seem like a standard practice, but we've seen many instances where these haven't been enabled, and this is a dangerous and potentially costly error for anyone who gains user privilege. They're going to be able to fill their boots with this sensitive data and run line. Same goes for storage encryption. This, of course, is to counter physical theft of disks and storage devices. So if someone runs off with disks or storage devices, then it's pretty useless if the data can't be decrypted easily. And finally, again, make sure you use SAP HANA firewalls. That's again included in SUSE for SAP, and it's there. It doesn't cost you anything extra. Take advantage of it. So investments in security, again, this is now talking a bit more general rather than specifically about the OS, but I mentioned this at the top. They're often made at the start of a project, such investments, and then sometimes it's very easy for complacency to set in, and given how fast technology moves, companies have got to move with the times and regularly review their security measures and be prepared to reinvest. Okay, so it's not just a kind of one hit at the start and then everything's okay. That's not going to work. There's got to be this healthy balance with those two sort of forms of security that I mentioned, top there, organizational and technological. You've got to maintain that balance, and it's great having the latest innovations in technology, but if your users aren't educated around the rules and the risks, then all the tech in the world's not going to stop an attack, because the people become those that are your weakest link, as it were, in terms of security and protection. Follow this zero trust approach if you can. As I say, can be a bit costly in the short term, but it will ultimately lead to higher levels of security. Just because you've got to put in place more things at the start, more belt and braces, as I mentioned, shore up all of the walls, and that can cost a little money up front. But my word, does it pay dividends down the line, particularly in the event of an attack or an attempted attack. Use third-party partners. We always encourage our customers to get their partners involved in any SAP project, particularly if it's a transformation project, as early as possible, because they will all generally have something of value to bring to the table around the planning and the strategy of the project. And we all know that SAP transformation projects, they can't be attempted lightly or without due care and attention. So involve all of those partners from the start. And if you don't think you've got the requisite in-house skills around security, bring in third parties, because it will be worth the consulting fee, just to make sure that you're doing absolutely everything you possibly can around all levels of security around your SAP environment. So Update the security frameworks, and again, reinvest and reinvest on a regular basis. Make sure that you're carrying out audits, penetration tests, whatever you can to test the mettle of your environment from a security perspective. Again, it's all just good housekeeping, and don't underestimate the benefits of doing this. And last but not least, on this slide, look at open source software, because there's a lot of open source tools out there: intrusion detection systems, vulnerability assessment systems, and security scanners and auditing systems, and they're usually cheaper than many of the kind of proprietary offerings. So it's definitely worth looking into open source software. However, if you do that, a bit like with Enterprise Linux, it's a support subscription. It's not a license maintenance model. So you're paying for your patches, updates, and support. And it's essential that when you subscribe to it, you don't just download the eval and use it, because it will become very insecure very quickly. You need to support that. You need to support update channels available to you. And you want to know you're feeling as secure as possible, that in the light of an incident, you can pick up the phone and know that you are covered because you have a current subscription. You're getting all the latest updates and patches, because they will stop if your subscription lapses to any open source technology. I can't tell you, how many incidents we've had where customers have contacted us because they've had an incident, or they've heard about a vulnerability, a CVE, and they want to get in front of that, and then they find out that their subscription's lapsed, they don't have support. And of course, while we will always do everything to help that customer, it will delay the process. So make sure that's all in place and is kept up to date, and that subscriptions are renewed. So it's a bit like buying a car. You buy a car, you get a year's worth of free insurance, your first year of insurance with the car, and then you think, well, I won't renew it because I haven't had any accidents this last year. It's the similar sort of analogy that kind of works in this regard, and that's what some customers have actually done, not realizing that they're not getting all the latest patches and updates, and they're cutting off their safety nets, from an open source vendor perspective. So as I say, perform these regular reviews around your stack and invest and reinvest, and it's always going to be cheaper than the cost of a breach, or data theft or data exposure. So just from a kind of wrap up perspective, just to kind of recap what we're talking about here. SAP Security is a mission critical system, as we know, and security around it and the underlying components is equally as critical. Every layer relates to the next and has an impact on the next, from the OS to the DB to the application layer. And more attacks are taking place on critical systems the world over. Now, IT, as I mentioned, IT security demands a holistic approach, and it's got to cover that organizational and physical security side of things in equal measure. As I say, keep that balance. Make sure that the OS layer, because it is a prime target where SAP systems are concerned. You can see there it says ranked second after applications and databases, naturally, because of course cyber criminals know the importance of the SAP system. So make sure that's kept fully up to date. Make sure you're taking advantage of all the features inherent in, for instance, something like SUSE Linux for SAP applications. Investigate each of them with us. Make sure you know what they can do for you, and make sure they're configured correctly and deployed and maintained to try and give you the ultimate in minimizing downtime. Use those external partners, as I've mentioned. Make sure that if you don't think you've got all the requisite skills in house, you do look elsewhere, because it will be worth that investment. So really, that kind of covers off most of what I wanted to talk about today. We could, of course, talk about this in extreme detail, but conscious of everyone's time, I don't want to waffle on too long. There's a few links here as to where you can find a few more SUSE specific security information. around our SUSE for SAP applications and related products. So do interrogate those. You may, of course, already be a customer of ours, and hopefully you're taking advantage of these resources, and you've worked those into your security plans, all of the recommendations you find in here. Other than that, I say thank you very much for listening to me. I hope that's been useful for you all, given you some things to think about. Always happy to talk to anyone if they want to drill into this a bit further, but for the meantime, I'll hand back to you, Rob.
All right. Thank you, Alan. Very informative. I thought there was a lot of great information in there. I mean, I know that, I mean, you mentioned it and talking about patching regularly, but I know that's one of the bigger challenges that people have. I know SUSE addresses this, at least at the operating system level, by allowing you to perform patching, without having to have any downtime. But obviously, when you're patching your SAP applications, that's not necessarily the case, right? You've got to make sure you schedule it, make sure you find the time. I mean, I think there was a cloud security report we did last year, and it was a much smaller proportion of respondents than I expected that sort of applied patches applied patches. Well, I think it was 53, 54, something like that percent who, when a critical patch became available, they applied it, in their as soon as they could. In their next patching schedule, and another maybe 15 or so percent that applied it immediately. But that leaves a significant chunk of people who are not applying those patches, immediately. And some of it, I think, is because, it's hard to sort of know in the SAP environment which patches you should be applying, why you're not applying some of these patches. It's hard to validate that these are the right ones to apply. Obviously, this is for SAP applications themselves. Sure. But I mean, I think your comments about patching and security in general are very well taken in terms of being relevant to both, your operating system and your SAP environment that's sitting on top of that, because they're all potentially areas that are open to vulnerability.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And the older the systems that you're running on in terms of updates, the more vulnerable those systems are. And we have this so often. Customer will come to us with a problem, and we'll find out what version they're on, and we realize they haven't updated their OS for, in some cases, 2 years. It's just virtual suicide in terms of opening yourself up for attack. And this is why we always kind of harp onto our customers about making sure that they've got all of these updates as automated, scheduled. They're taking advantage of live patching, and they're keeping the OS up to date, because, as I mentioned, you've got weak links throughout, and if all three of those layers, DB, application, and OS, aren't kept up to date as often as possible, you are kind of becoming a little bit more the system will all lack. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. The integrity of that whole SAP landscape is then up for question.
Yeah, I know that I've seen research that sort of suggests that as soon as a vulnerability is, made publicly available through, a patch node, a CVE, whatever, literally it's a matter of hours before people start exploiting those vulnerabilities, which is why it's important to sort of keep up with that patching. But I know that, you sort of you give a lot of great general advice, adding to sort of, or over and above what you've perhaps covered today, what should SAP customers be thinking about for the future around security for SAP?
That's a good question. So if we look at containers, I think this is something that comes up. Now, SAP have only containerized one of their applications at the moment, SAP Data Intelligence, which used to be called SAP Data Hub, which is a kind of data aggregator tool. Not a huge amount of uptake on it at the moment, but of course it's growing. But it's highly likely that given that, SAP are going to SAP are going to make available a lot more of their applications in a containerized format. So, and because as soon as you bring in containers, of course, They have great use and great benefit in the right scenario. But of course, security around containers becomes an aspect that we then have to consider. So there should always be a degree of security applied to the Kubernetes product in question, or the container support application in question. And HANA, I think, is going to be probably one of the next ones that becomes containerized in some way, shape, or form over the next few years. Now, currently, if a customer's running SAP Data Intelligence, then, for instance, if they're running on premises, that demands a containerized application or containerized OS beneath it. So we have situations where customers are running SAP DI, they're running it on SUSE's Rancher 3.0 or above, which is SAP certified to do that. And then we've got SAP's new Vector, SUSE's new Vector, which was actually the security component that should also be applied at the same time. So as SAP applications, DBs, etc., but more products from SAP become containerized or available in that format, then customers need to look at the security around that as well. And that will then all become part of this kind of good housekeeping best practices process and design.
Yeah, I was just, there's a lot of companies that are potentially leveraging containers, edge computing, right? Because it's very easy, even if it's not your SAP application, to create a container, particularly if you're a retail type scenario or a manufacturing scenario. You can send that container out to, a device at the edge, has everything, that endpoint needs to process and send information back to your SAP Sense, systems that are sitting in your core somewhere. And, there's a lot of potential for exploit there. And I was reading something just the other day about people needing to be careful around container security, edge security. And, I think that very much plays into, what you're talking about there of ensuring that, you are doing these things, securing these things appropriately. I mean, obviously, as you said, it's just data intelligence that is currently supported for containerization from SAP. Although it'll be interesting to sort of see how that changes with the announcement of SAP DataSphere, which sort of combines data intelligence, data warehouse cloud, and data analytics cloud into sort of a more closely tied suite of applications. So certainly some good advice there, because I think there's a lot of companies that they're using those technologies. And I guess the other sort of big question, I mean, not necessarily Chat GPT or anything like that specifically, but with the revolution in artificial intelligence that is sort of happening all around us, everyone's sort of familiar with people doing things with Chat GPT, getting code from Chat GPT. Google have just announced Google Bard. What would you sort of imagine the impact would have for typical SAP customers from a security perspective?
Yeah, again, it's a good question. And I think we're already sick, all of us, of Chat GPT. It seems to be just everywhere, as you suggest, both from a work perspective and personally. But these chatbots, they're free, available to use, can be used as a conversation tool, as we know, but can write texts and emails and rephrase and summarize text. But it's not the only one of these, these LLMs, these large language models that are out there. There are open source tools that are out there, and these can be used by the bad guys as well as the rest of us for good purposes. Okay, so it will become, no question, as it becomes more prevalent, it will become a tool for those for the cyber criminals, no question about it. Things like ChatGPT, of course, have got security measures around them, but it's definitely going to be open to misuse and abuse. So it's a bit like the previous example. Every time there's an advancement in technology that could positively affect an SAP customer with applications that are new to them and can give them different angles and edges for their business, there is a whole question of security that comes straight in behind that, that has to be considered. And I think, you know, you've got, and we've all seen phishing emails, and we all get them. We've had them coming through for years. Usually they're easily identifiable because it's badly formatted text or grammar, and you can spot them a mile off. Then there's ones that are a little more refined and perhaps take a little bit more investigation. But this AI revolution, and you take, for example, things like ChatGPT and some of the attack vectors I mentioned earlier, the refinements are quite frightening. And you could have someone who has, you know, from a social engineering perspective, looked into somebody's persona and can come up with phishing emails, for instance, that are so convincing that even those who are pretty sharp could fall victim to the trap. You've also got, you know, these tools can write malicious code. They can generate deep fakes, which can be used to, you know, for image generation from an AI perspective, which can also be used to kind of blackmail people to perhaps release passwords or sensitive data. So, as I say, whenever there's a new wave of technology, it will always generally have a great deal of use and benefit for everyone, but there will always be the security aspect that has to be considered behind that.
Yeah,
and
certainly.
That's not just for SAP customers, of course, that's for anybody.
No, that's absolutely for anybody. And as you said, you know, the emails are getting better. And with these artificial intelligence tools, which, you know, you take an open source one and you can train it any way you want, right? So someone out there could well be training these for malicious purposes, because people have been making so much money that way. But I mean, I think I did see, I know I saw something the other day that said something like 94% of compromise in systems is through email breaches, right? So a credible sender impersonation, you know, this sort of thing where you get the email from someone, you know, claiming to be something else. And yeah, I mean, I think I was reading yesterday, there was a commercial sort of commercial architecture or commercial property management that was almost compromised for 40 million euros because of a credible sender impersonation. And you know, fortunately, there was an AI tool that they had in security that picked up the domain was different. But you know, that actually, it sounds like a lot of money, but in commercial property transactions, that isn't necessarily a lot of money. So, but I mean, with the sort of money on the line that, you know, we're talking about, especially if you get access to an SAP system and a global multinational company, you really do have the crown jewels. You have access to all of the information about how the company is operating and performing. So definitely steps for people to be concerned about and to ensure that their systems are protected. So yeah, I mean, those were the sort of questions I had, Alan. But any final thoughts before I wrap things up?
No, as I say, I think, you know, I think we've covered everything in the session there. It's just to say we're not saying any of this to scaremonger. This is really just to try and drive home the importance around security of these systems, as if it needs to be driven home anymore. Because so many businesses depend, just as you've just mentioned there, on their SAP systems as the lifeblood. And as soon as it goes down, it starts costing money. So it's definitely worth investing and reinvesting in security. Every time you do anything to your SAP environment, or even with your current environment, to say, even if you haven't maybe migrated or transformed yet, whether it's on premises, whether it's in the cloud, apply all of those tools. Use every trick you possibly can, because you can be certain the cyber criminals will.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, as I think I've read somewhere, they only have to be successful once. You have to be successful in defending your systems every time, every day.
Absolutely. A very good point.
All right. Thank you so much for attending today's webinar. As I noted before, if you have asked a question during the session, it will be collected and we will ensure that they are answered within the next few days. Shortly after the webinar is complete, you will receive an email allowing you to access the presentation on demand along with today's slideshow. So on behalf of SAP Insider and our guest, Alan from SUSE, thank you so much for your time and have a great day.
Thank you.